No one expected that the wife of a powerful CEO would ever be found crying alone in a bathroom stall at a charity gala. But that night, I was. I remember gripping the edge of the sink, mascara streaked down my face, trying to steady my breathing, while the sound of laughter floated in from the ballroom. That laughter cut me like glass, because I knew it was my husband's. Out there, under the shimmering chandeliers, he was the man everyone admired, tall, commanding, generous with his smiles. Women leaned in too close, men clapped his back with admiration, and cameras flashed every time he raised his glass. He was untouchable. And yet, in that moment, I was convinced that I meant nothing to him at all. My chest ached as I thought about the way he had brushed my hand off earlier, like I was a child tugging at his sleeve. The way his eyes lingered on someone else when he thought I wasn't looking. I had sworn to myself that I wouldn't be the kind of wife who got jealous, who picked fights over petty things. But there I was, suffocating in my own insecurities, hiding in the ladies' room while my husband entertained the world without me. The irony was sharp. People envied me, whispered about how lucky I was to have married into a life of wealth and prestige. They saw diamonds on my wrist, the designer dress hugging my frame, the photographs of us smiling on magazine covers. What they didn't see was how small I often felt next to him, like I was just an accessory to his life, rather than his partner. I splashed cold water on my face, but it didn't wash away the sting in my chest. That night was supposed to be a celebration. Instead, it was the first time I admitted to myself that our love was slipping through my fingers, and I had no idea how to hold on. That night at the gala, with my tears smudging my makeup in a bathroom stall, was not an isolated moment. It was the tipping point of something that had been growing inside me for years. To understand why, I need to take you back to the beginning, back to the girl I was before I ever became his wife. I wasn't raised for ballrooms or black tie events. I grew up in a modest neighborhood outside Cleveland, the kind of place where everyone knew each other's business, and summers smelled like asphalt and fried food. My father worked at a manufacturing plant, his hands always calloused, his back always aching. My mother pulled long shifts at a diner, her smile tired but determined. They did their best for me, but I grew up knowing the weight of bills stacked on the kitchen counter, and the quiet frustration of wanting more than what we could afford. I wasn't extraordinary. Not the prettiest, not the smartest, not the girl everyone wanted, but I was quick with a laugh, quick to soften a tense room, quick to notice when someone else needed comfort. That was my strength, or at least, it used to be. When I graduated from college, I landed an internship at a Chicago real estate firm. I didn't know then that my life was about to change. The CEO of that firm was David Miller. He was everything my world wasn't: sharp suits, sharp words, and an aura that seemed to bend a room around him. I'd never met anyone like him before. I was 22, nervous and eager. He was 30, already a man other men admired and envied. My first memory of him was watching him walk into a meeting, tall, confident, carrying the kind of authority you can't fake. I remember thinking, men like that don't even notice girls like me. But he did. It started in small, almost imperceptible ways. A smile across the table when I cracked a nervous joke. A compliment slipped into a meeting when I handed him a report. Then, one late evening when most of the office had cleared out, he stopped at my desk. His question was so simple, yet it cut through me. What makes you feel alive? I froze. No one had ever asked me that before, not my parents, not my friends, not even past boyfriends. After a pause, I confessed that I loved to paint, even though I wasn't very good at it. He didn't laugh. Instead, he said, "That's the point. It's not about being good, it's about remembering you're alive." That moment branded itself on me. It made me feel seen, maybe for the first time in my life. Our relationship unfolded quickly after that. Dinners that turned into long walks that turned into confessions that turned into a whirlwind romance. By the end of a year, I had a diamond on my finger, a mansion to live in, and the kind of lifestyle I'd only ever seen in glossy magazines. Everyone around me called me lucky, and for a while, I believed them. But being the wife of a CEO is not like the fairy tales. It didn't take long before the shine began to wear off. The first crack appeared at a company holiday party. I had spent hours choosing the perfect dress, rehearsing polite conversation, telling myself I belonged in his world. But the moment we arrived, it was as though I had vanished. The spotlight was on him, always on him. Colleagues crowded around, glasses raised, voices loud with admiration. When they looked at me, it was only to make polite comments about how young I looked, how cute I was. Cute. Not elegant, not poised, just cute. I laughed along, pretending not to mind, but inside, I felt small. Diminished. Like a child tagging along behind her father rather than a wife standing beside her husband. David never noticed my discomfort. Or if he did, he didn't acknowledge it. He was too busy dazzling the room. I told myself it was part of the package, that he came home to me at night, held me close, kissed my forehead before falling asleep. That was enough, wasn't it? But those moments grew fewer. His phone buzzed constantly. Business dinners extended late into the night. Trips stretched from days into weeks. And when he was home, his mind wasn't. He would sit at the dinner table, phone in hand, eyes skimming numbers and reports, while I sat across from him in silence. That silence became my companion. And then came the whispers. The women who noticed him, how could they not? He was tall, charming, wealthy. At first it was harmless, a laugh that lingered too long, a hand brushing his arm in conversation. But soon, rumors began to trickle in. A secretary spotted, leaving his office late at night. A journalist who seemed to know details about him no article had ever printed. I never had proof, but suspicion grew like a splinter lodged beneath my skin, small but agonizing. I didn't accuse him outright. Instead, I turned the suspicion inward. I scrutinized my body in the mirror. I tried new diets, new makeup, new clothes. No matter what I did, I always felt lesser compared to the women in his orbit, sleek, polished, intimidatingly confident. That's when jealousy began to poison me. I became clingy in ways I hated. I texted him too much, asked too many questions, picked fights over little things. When I couldn't hold back the insecurity, I lashed out sarcastic remarks, cold shoulders, childish attempts to provoke him. If he complimented a colleague's work, I sulked for days. If he left me home too long, I staged little tests, posting photos online, making sure he'd see other men noticing me, pretending I didn't care. But I always cared, desperately. There's one night I'll never forget. He had just returned from a long trip, exhausted. His tie was loosened, his shoulders slumped. Instead of welcoming him, I demanded answers. Where had he been? Who had he been with? Did he still love me? The words came out sharp, defensive, desperate. He didn't shout. He didn't argue. He just looked at me with tired eyes and said, "You make it so hard to come home sometimes." Those words broke me. For weeks after, I lived like a ghost. We spoke less and less. He buried himself in work, and I drifted through the house like a shadow. I stopped painting. I stopped seeing friends. I barely called my parents. Every day blurred into the next, heavy with shame and silence. I hated myself for being weak, for being jealous, for being the kind of wife people whispered about. And yet, the thought of leaving him filled me with panic. I told myself I couldn't live without him, even though I already was. One afternoon, I remember standing in front of the mirror, wearing a designer dress, my hair perfectly styled. Outwardly, I looked like every headline called me the lucky wife of a CEO. But staring back at me was a stranger, fragile, bitter, insecure. I didn't recognize her. And still, the cruelest truth was this: I loved him. Fiercely, painfully, hopelessly. That love kept me tethered, even as it suffocated me. The night of the gala, when I found myself crying alone in that bathroom, wasn't just a breakdown. It was the moment I realized I had lost myself entirely. The girl who once laughed easily, who painted to feel alive, who believed she had something to offer, she was gone. And I didn't know if I could ever get her back. After the gala night, something in me shifted. I had reached the bottom of my spiral, and for weeks afterward, I carried myself like a hollow shell. I went through the motions, smiling at charity events, showing up for luncheons, walking beside him at red carpets, but inside, I was empty. But life doesn't let you sit still forever. Sometimes, the world forces you to wake up in the most unexpected ways. It started with a humiliation I will never forget. One afternoon, I accompanied David to a board luncheon at a downtown hotel. The wives of his colleagues were seated at a separate table, and I found myself among them, women older, elegant, dripping in quiet confidence. They spoke casually about their travels to Europe, their children's private schools, the foundations they chaired. When the conversation turned to me, one of them asked, "So, what do you do?" I froze, my fork covered in midair. Before I could answer, another woman smirked. She doesn't work, she shops. The table erupted in polite laughter. I forced a smile, but my cheeks burned hot. I wanted to defend myself, but the truth was, I didn't have anything to say. I hadn't worked in years. I hadn't pursued painting, or anything else for that matter. I had let my entire identity shrink to one word: wife. That night, I cried alone in our guest bedroom, ashamed not of them, but of myself. They weren't wrong. I had become someone without a voice, without purpose. Days later, a delivery arrived at the house, a set of canvases and paints I didn't remember ordering. When I checked the receipt, I realized it was from my mother. She had sent them with a note, "Don't forget who you are." The words pierced me. I stared at the blank canvas for days before finally picking up a brush. My hands shook. The first strokes were clumsy, hesitant. But slowly, I began to lose myself in the colors. I stayed up late painting, sometimes until dawn, smearing my emotions onto the canvas: anger, grief, longing, hope. I hadn't realized how much I had bottled up until it poured out in shades of red and blue. For the first time in years, I felt alive again. But just as I began to rediscover myself, the tension with David grew worse. He seemed more distant, buried in endless meetings. And when he was home, he barely noticed me. I didn't tell him about the painting. I told myself he wouldn't care. Then came the breaking point. One evening, he came home late, exhausted. I was in the living room, cleaning brushes, when I noticed a faint perfume on his suit jacket. It wasn't mine. My chest tightened as dread crept over me. I wanted to ask, to scream, to demand the truth. But instead, I said nothing. The silence stretched for days. Finally, one night, I couldn't hold it in. My voice trembled as I asked, "Do you still love me?" He didn't answer right away. The pause was long enough to shatter me. When he finally spoke, his words were soft but sharp. "I don't even know who you are anymore." I broke. For hours after he went to bed, I sat in the dark living room, clutching one of my half-finished paintings, sobbing silently. I wanted to scream, to run, to disappear. But then I remembered my mother's note. "Don't forget who you are." Something inside me hardened. If he no longer saw me, then I would make myself visible again, not for him, but for me. The next morning, I reached out to a local art studio. They were hosting a community showcase for amateur painters, and without overthinking, I signed up. It was terrifying. I hadn't shown anyone my work since college, but the thought of standing on my own 2 feet again lit a fire inside me. For weeks, I painted relentlessly. I poured every ounce of my jealousy, my shame, my longing for love into those canvases. And on the night of the showcase, when I stood in that small gallery surrounded by strangers, I felt something I hadn't in years: pride. People stopped to look. Some smiled. Some nodded thoughtfully. One even asked if I would sell a piece. My heart nearly burst. For the first time in so long, I was more than just David's wife. I was me. But life has a way of colliding the old and the new. Because that night, David showed up. I don't know if it was curiosity, guilt, or simply his habit of controlling every part of my life, but I saw him the moment he walked in, towering in his tailored suit, out of place among the bohemian crowd. My stomach twisted. I wanted to shrink, to disappear, but then I saw him stop in front of one of my paintings, a swirl of dark blues and jagged reds, raw and messy, born from the nights I cried alone. He stood there for a long time, his jaw tightened, his eyes unreadable. Later, when the crowd thinned, he approached me. His voice was low. "You did these." I nodded, my throat tight. For once, he didn't have a polished response. He just looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time in years. Then he said something I'll never forget. I didn't realize how much I'd been missing. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't enough to erase the pain. But it was the first crack in the wall between us. In the days that followed, something shifted. He began asking me about my art, about what I was working on. At first, I thought it was pity or guilt. But then I noticed how he lingered in the studio doorway, how he watched me paint like he once watched me laugh years ago. And slowly, I realized he wasn't just seeing my art, he was seeing me. Of course, it wasn't simple. Old habits die hard. My jealousy still flared when women lingered too close to him at events. His neglectful tendencies didn't vanish overnight. But now, for the first time, I wasn't waiting helplessly for his attention. I had my own fire burning, my own voice returning. And strangely, the more I stood on my own, the more he seemed to come back to me. One evening, after weeks of cautious distance, he sat beside me in the studio. His hand brushed mine, tentative, almost shy. "I miss us," he said quietly. Tears welled in my eyes, but for once, I didn't feel weak. I felt strong enough to choose. Strong enough to say, "If you want me, you'll have to see me. Really see me." And for the first time in a long time, I believed he just might. That was the turning point, not the gallery. Not his words, but the realization that I didn't need his validation to exist. I had lost myself in jealousy, in insecurity, in being the CEO's little wife. But I was more than that. And he was finally starting to remember it too. The night David sat beside me in the studio and whispered that he missed us was the first time in years I felt a real possibility of healing. But I knew better than to think words alone could fix everything. Words had always come easy for him, sharp in the boardroom, charming at galas. What mattered now was action, not promises. So I didn't fall into his arms, and I didn't cry with relief. Instead, I nodded, dipped my brush in paint, and continued working. If he wanted to be part of my world again, he would have to learn how to sit in the silence with me. How to see me not as a shadow, but as a whole person. And to my surprise, he did. In the weeks that followed, David began spending more evenings at home. At first, he lingered at the doorway of my studio, watching quietly as I painted. Then, he started asking questions, not perfunctory, but genuine. Why that color? What does this shape mean? At first, I answered cautiously, unsure if he was humoring me. But when I saw him listening, really listening, something inside me softened. It wasn't just about art, it was about finally being seen. And yet, the changes weren't only his. I was changing too. I stopped living only in his orbit. I joined a local artist collective. I started attending workshops, meeting other painters, finding community outside of his shadow. I reconnected with old friends I had abandoned in my spiral of jealousy. Slowly, I rebuilt myself piece by piece. Not as his wife, but as me. The more I did, the more our marriage began to balance. For the first time in years, I could stand beside him without feeling small. I wasn't the jealous little wife anymore. I was a woman with her own voice, her own worth. But redemption isn't smooth. There was still an antagonist, though not a villain in the traditional sense. My greatest antagonist was still my own jealousy. One evening, we attended another charity gala. It was the first one since my breakdown months earlier, and I was terrified. The same glittering chandeliers, the same beautiful women in sequined gowns, the same cameras flashing as David entered the room. A part of me felt the old panic rising. He doesn't see you, you'll never be enough. Then, across the room, I noticed one of the women leaning too close, her laugh light and flirtatious. My chest tightened, the jealousy flared hot and ugly, threatening to pull me back into the spiral. But instead of fleeing to the bathroom like before, I took a deep breath. I walked to the refreshments table, grabbed a glass of water, and grounded myself. I reminded myself of the truth: I wasn't competing. I wasn't a shadow. I was whole. With or without his gaze. When I looked up again, David was already watching me. And this time, instead of ignoring me or brushing me aside, he crossed the room, placed his hand gently at the small of my back, and introduced me to the very people who once made me feel invisible. His voice was steady, proud. "This is my wife. She's an artist." The words sank into me like sunlight. Not cute, not just my wife, but an artist. Recognition, respect. It was a small moment, but for me, it was monumental. Over the months that followed, David changed in ways I hadn't expected. He still worked long hours, still commanded rooms, still lived in a world larger than life. But he also made space for me. He attended one of my showcases, standing quietly in the back as others admired my work. He asked me to help decorate his office with my paintings, telling his colleagues proudly who had made them. And at home, he put his phone away at dinner, looking me in the eye the way he used to years ago. Were we perfect number? There were still arguments, still moments of doubt, but the balance had shifted. Our marriage was no longer about me chasing him or him tolerating me. It was about two people learning to see each other again. And as for me, the greatest redemption wasn't in winning back his attention. It was in winning back myself. I learned to embrace the jealousy, not as a flaw, but as a sign of how deeply I longed to be seen. I learned that love isn't about shrinking yourself to fit someone else's world. It's about growing so that you both can stand side by side. And I learned that sometimes the most painful failures are the very things that force you to rediscover your worth. Looking back now, I don't hate the girl I used to be, the insecure, fragile wife who cried in the bathroom stall. I understand her. She was drowning in a world too big for her, clinging desperately to love she feared losing. She wasn't weak. She was lost. And sometimes, being lost is the only way to be found. David once told me, long before we were married, that painting wasn't about being good, it was about remembering you were alive. I didn't understand then, but I do now. Love is the same way. It isn't about perfection, or appearances, or living up to other people's envy. It's about remembering you're alive together and separately. So yes, I was the CEO's jealous little wife. But I am also more than that. I am a woman who fought her way through shame, insecurity, and fear to stand on her own feet again. And in doing so, I didn't just save a marriage, I saved myself.